firmly attached for the ride home. And then you can see a window over to the right of your screen. Those have had some window covers on them. They removed both of those, but they are still available so that when the crew go to sleep later tonight, they'll be able to put those window covers back up. That'll keep them from seeing a sunrise every 45 minutes or a sunset, because the space station, as we mentioned, is orbiting Earth at 17,500 miles an hour. And so they see quite a few beautiful views, sunrises and sunsets every day, 16 to be exact.
Yeah, and you can actually kind of get a sense for how bright that might be. Spacecraft and the International Space Station are currently not in the Earth's shadow, so in sunlight, and you can see how bright the window can get, almost rivaling the lights in the cabin. Now that window is actually right next to the side hatch, so you can see there's a black strip next to that window. That's actually a handrest, a handhold, and next to that is the side hatch. And that's actually what Bob and Doug will be egressing out of after they do, after successful reentry, parachute deployment, and splashdown.
Yeah, so that's what we saw the crew climb in. Once they crossed that crew access arm, that last place that they were on Earth in that white room, they climbed in through that side hatch, but that's not what's attached to the International Space Station. The nose cone on Crew Dragon opens up and, as you said, exposes those thrusters underneath, and they actually floated through that hatch. So they arrived through that one and departed through that one, but once they get back on Earth, that side hatch is the primary egress or exit from the vehicle for Bob Behnke and Doug Hurley.
Yeah, and actually one of the steps right when Bob and Doug had entered the vehicle on the launch pad was to do a leak check of that hatch. Hatch remains sealed the entire time while we're in space, and really only gets opened once we're back safely on Earth.
So pretty noteworthy about this mission, there are a lot of firsts for this mission. It's our return to flight from American soil for the first time in 9 years, since the space shuttle program. And it's also going to be the first splashdown in over 45 years. So actually on July 24th, just a couple of weeks ago, that was the 45-year anniversary of the last Apollo capsule splashdown with the Apollo-Soyuz test project. So it's been a long time since we've seen a crew splashdown. That typically happens with a landing. Of course, the shuttle was an orbiter and could land like a plane. And then the Soyuz, which astronauts have been arriving in for the past 9 years, that lands on land in the steppes of Kazakhstan. So this one we're looking to land in the Gulf Coast. It means a much quicker ride home for Bob and Doug once they get back.
Yeah, once we get through the Earth's atmosphere, we'll have 2 drogue chutes deploy and then 4 main chutes deploy, and then splashdown currently targeted for Pensacola, so off the west coast of Florida. And recovery actually looks a little bit different than it did 45 years ago. So we have some pretty cool recovery boats, have helicopter pads on them, as well as what we refer to as it's as an A-arm, but it's basically a crane on the back of the spacecraft. So, on the back of the boat. And a couple of fast boat teams will go out to the capsule, verify that it's safe to approach. Then that boat will come up, scoop up the Dragon spacecraft, put it on the deck. They'll secure everything and then open up the hatches and help Bob and Doug egress on the recovery ship.
If you've ever seen any of that old Apollo footage, the astronauts actually used to get out in the water. And so a little bit different this time. The crew will be waiting until that boat arrives with that crane to lift them up onto the deck, and they'll get the chance to get out on the boat instead of on the seas.
Yeah, and actually for recovery, we have 7 potential recovery sites, what we refer to as supported landing sites. So those are areas where a recovery team can get there very quickly, recover the crew within a couple of hours of their splashdown, but usually actually much faster than that. So we've got 4 sites in the Gulf Coast on the west, or in the Gulf on the west coast of Florida, and then 3 sites on the east coast of Florida. One of them, of course, being Cape Canaveral.
So as we were watching this past week, this tropical storm become a hurricane, there was some concern about returning today because we do have some recovery criteria. Landing in the water is a lot more difficult than landing on land because you have to consider things like wave height and wind speed. And so we're looking at those spaces in the Gulf, and they're looking pretty good compared to, obviously, the spaces on the east side of Florida. But yes, we have to take into consideration what the helicopters can arrive in and what all the boats can withstand and what the vessel, the crew capsule itself can withstand.
Yeah, that's right. The hurricane Isaias moving up, I think, the east coast of Florida now. So hopefully folks are staying safe out there. I know Doug actually took some photos from the cupola of this hurricane as it's moving up the east coast. But luckily, no major impact to weather on the west coast. Good winds, no significant lightning, no significant rain is projected for the area. And I think importantly as well, the wave heights, which are important for the spacecraft, but also for the recovery ship to be able to get close and for teams to secure the spacecraft and ensure that it's safe for recovery.
So currently we are in a hold period of the vestibule depressurization. That's the area between the hatches that the astronauts fly through or float through when they arrive and float through when they depart. So we are holding at 5 pounds per square inch for 25 minutes to make sure that checks out, and they continue with depressurization after that. But Bob and Doug, as you can see, this view over their shoulder, it makes it look like we're on the ride with them. They have donned their suits. They are in their seats, monitoring everything on those screens aboard Crew Dragon.
Why don't we actually check in with Gary at Johnson Space Center in Houston, hear how things are going on the space station side, and how do things look at Johnson, Gary?
Hey, Shiva, things are looking great here. We are also watching that vestibule depressurization, of course, complete now, holding at 5 psi. We're just looking at that thermal stabilization, just waiting for it to stabilize, balance out its swings, so we can get a nice solid leak check before continuing down close to vacuum. On the International Space Station side, we did close the A-Pass hatch, affixing that with a docking target. It's a rod with a little X at the end of it. Chris Cassidy performing those duties and taking some closeout photos, just making sure that everything was okay, checking the configuration, and that'll be reported to teams here on the ground so they understand the configuration for future crews to visit. He then loaded up that pressurized mating adapter. That was that tube that he was on the other side of which was closing the A-Pass hatch, putting some items in there for storage, and then eventually he did successfully close and lock the Node 2 forward hatch, completing his duties for the day. So he will be, of course, watching Bob and Doug depart the station. He'll be in the cupola module. This is that 7-bay window that looks right down on the Earth, provides a very good view of the Dragon departing from the forward end of the International Space Station. He'll have a camera right in his hand and be able to take some pictures as they depart the International Space Station. But the primary monitoring role will actually be in the hands of Bob and Doug. The Dragon vehicle being an autonomous departure vehicle, Bob and Doug being able to take control if necessary with the monitoring role, and then the backup monitoring role here in Mission Control Houston. So as soon as we continue this depressurization of the vestibule close to vacuum, just about 4:20 p.m. Pacific time, we're looking to conduct a go, no-go. That's, I think, a little bit less than an hour from now at this time that we'll conduct a go, no-go to start the undocking sequence. So the undocking sequence will be attaching the umbilical and then releasing 12 hooks in sets of 6, 2 sets of 6. There's going to be 2 pulses that are going to be fired from the Dragon end. They're called undocking burns, and they'll actually physically separate Dragon vehicle from the International Space Station. That's scheduled just a little bit after 4:30 p.m. Pacific time today. So far, everything looking good, holding steady right now, 5 psi, looking to continue that depressurization here soon. With that, everything looking good from the International Space Station flight control room. We'll send it back over to Hawthorne.
Thanks, Gary. Appreciate that update. If you're just joining us, the Dragon spacecraft is currently forward hatch sealed. The Earlier today, Bob and Doug had actually loaded some powered cargo into the vehicle, and the life support system is reactivated. And then after sealing the hatches on both the International Space Station side and stepping into the spacecraft, we did some leak checks on the suits to step into vestibule leak checks now.
Yeah, and so that vestibule area, we're holding at 5 psi, 5 pounds per square inch to conduct and make sure that it is holding and not fluctuating due to any temperature changes. Actually, the crew on the International Space Station, as I mentioned earlier, this is evening for them. And so it's actually 10:30 almost aboard the International Space Station, 10:30 p.m. And so they'll be getting ready to go to sleep soon. The crew here in Crew Dragon got to take a 3-hour nap today in the middle of the day. Looks like actually the whole crew was able to enjoy that nap. That way they'd all be alert and ready to conduct these departure procedures, whether it be sealing up the hatches or conducting any of the leak checks, monitoring the ride home. We want to make sure the astronauts are well rested, and even though the crew on the International Space Station will get their sleep period soon, we'll see Bob and Doug get theirs. They'll have about 8 hours later tonight to get some shut-eye.
Yeah, that'll actually sleep shift them well before they start to step into the deorbit burn, which is actually the largest burn of the day and actually a pretty dynamic period time for them. So I want to make sure that they are all well rested so they can monitor and step in if they have to take any contingency actions, and also read back on the status of the vehicle if ground control teams are unable to properly assess the health of the system. Of course, one of the nice things about having crew members aboard is they can see the health of the vehicle and they can respond. Bob and Doug able to issue commands via those touchscreen displays, and also getting quite a bit of training on potential emergency scenarios, wave-offs, scenarios where they might need to interact with Dragon, and if it were to lose comms or have a thruster issue. But right now, very healthy vehicle. Haven't really seen any issues with Dragon during its 63-day stay at the International Space Station.
And if you were wondering, once Dragon departs today from the International Space Station, we're not going anywhere. We're actually going to be live all the way until they come home to Earth tomorrow. So some of the bigger things we can look forward to after undocking, we've got a couple of departure burns. The first two are going to bring Dragon up and over the International Space Station, and then the next two will bring it down and in front of the space station before a phasing burn later this afternoon to help it really sync up with its landing zone for tomorrow.
That's right. I might have heard a call.
Heard a little something.
Okay, there might be a call coming on Space to Ground. We'll be sure to keep an eye out for that.
Looks like pressure in the vestibule is still holding.
Yeah, and so as part of those burns that they have to do, the first couple of burns are really just to adjust the apogee and the perigee. So the apogee, if you can imagine the orbit of a spacecraft as an ellipse going around the Earth, the apogee is the highest point, or the point farthest away from the planet, and the perigee is the lowest point. And so right now, Dragon and the International Space Station, of course, still docked, and they're in a roughly circular orbit. After the conclusion of these departure burns, Dragon's apogee will be about 10 kilometers below the International Space Station, but we'll be slowly reducing our perigee. And then later on tonight, Pacific time, we'll actually conduct what's called a phasing burn. And the goal there is to adjust the orientation of that orbit just so we get our orbital pathway to line up over the landing site, where we will, or line up with a path that will cross over the landing site, where we can, when we issue our departure burn sequence, we'll be able to line up landing off the coast of Florida near Pensacola.
As you can see, Bob Behnke and Doug Harley in their suits now, but after those first couple of departure burns, they'll actually be able to take off their suits, and they won't need to put them back on or don them again until tomorrow, just before the deorbit burn. And then they'll wear them the entire rest of the ride home. But for the majority of the rest of the evening after the departure burns 1 and 2, they'll be able to take off those spacesuits, relax a little bit more, enjoy their ride in Crew Dragon. And while Crew Dragon was on the International Space Station, we actually conducted some habitability test. Of course, there's 2 astronauts flying today, but our future crews are scheduled to have 4 astronauts. So we brought in a couple of the space station's current residents to test out what it's like to have multiple people in Dragon once it's in microgravity. Performed lots of tests inside the vehicle. They had a little sleep period to see how it would be to sleep with 4 people in the vehicle, and things went pretty well. Looking forward to that first Crew 1 launch later this year.
Yeah, so right now, Dragon and the International Space Station about 422 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And going about 7.6 kilometers per second. Should be close to that 17,500 number that you probably hear pretty often.
Yes, and if you're looking at miles, it looks like we're about 261 statute miles above the Earth. And they are in the South Pacific Ocean. They'll be coming up across Hawaii not too long from now.
There's a view from the International Space Station looking at the Dragon spacecraft. So Bob and Doug inside the portion towards the right of your screen. If you can imagine how they're seating upright, their displays would sort of be looking up towards the direction the nose cone is opened up. And behind them is the trunk of the spacecraft. So that top side, the black shiny part, is actually our solar panels on the body of the spacecraft. And below that, the white side of the spacecraft is the radiator. So that's where we're radiating away our heat generated by the avionics and the electronic hardware aboard the vehicle, and of course from Bob and Doug themselves. Generating a little bit of heat based on how much physical activity and exertion they're doing. Right now it looks like they're pretty comfortable, just kind of hanging out in their suits.
And actually, the vestibule leak check has started, and so they're testing to ensure the solidarity of those seals between the hatches. And as we saw earlier, they checked to make sure there was no foreign object debris or FOD, so that they would have a clean seal and be able to complete this leak check successfully. Another step toward undocking.
These leak checks should be pretty fast. They'll be looking to see if there's any pressure rise on the vestibule itself, which would indicate pressure coming through the forward hatch seal.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop. Vestibule thermal stabilization is complete and the leak check period has started. Additionally, the Dragon to ground path is now available. If you would like to swap one of your audio destinations to Dragon to ground, I am happy to support a comm check at this time.
Okay, Bob will do that. SpaceX Dragon, comm checks, Dragon to ground.
I hear you loud and clear. Help me.
And Anna, you came in very quiet. I'll bump up that channel and maybe we could try it again.
Copy. How is this?
That's a little bit better, Anna, but got it cranked up to be able to hear you just for your awareness. A little bit different volume between the big loop and hearing you on the big loop and hearing you on Dragon to ground.
Copy. I will make sure to talk loudly into the Dragon to ground path.
And Dragon, Houston on Dragon to ground for a comm check. How do you copy me?
And Houston, we have you loud and clear on Dragon to ground.
Actually, my bad. I was not on the correct loop. Comm check again on Dragon to ground from Houston.
Okay, Leslie, we have you loud and clear on Dragon to ground. Much clearer, much less echo on this loop than the big loop.
That's a good data point, and we also have you loud and clear down here.
So we just heard some comm checks between the crew aboard the Crew Dragon and the core here on the ground, and then with the Capcom in Houston. They're two very similar positions. We call ours the Capcom because it stands for Capsule Communicator, and we are in a capsule once again. For a few years there, obviously we were flying a space shuttle, so not quite a capsule, but before that we had Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, all capsules, and this person was once used to be typically an astronaut so that they could communicate any specific details about the vehicle, especially based on their previous experience. Now we have Capcoms who are not necessarily astronauts, but obviously very, very well studied in the vehicle.
Yeah, the way we refer to them is the crew's advocate on the ground. They're trying to think of things ahead of their crew and have information that the crew might need but they tend to act as the advocate for the crew on the ground, letting them know where equipment might be stored in the vehicle, letting them know of upcoming steps. If there's any troubleshooting that the crew need to do or information that the crew need, they interact with the crew. Typically also train very closely with the crew in simulations and also during their training periods to get them familiar with all of the procedures that they need to operate in the spacecraft. Now, during those comm checks, there was some discussion about the big loop and Dragon to Ground and Space to Ground, a lot of different loops. Really what a loop just refers to is a communications link. Operators all have the ability to talk on these loops and provide real-time communication. Usually they are redundant loops, so if you had a problem with one of the comm systems, then there's a redundant backup so you can ensure you have good voice communication with the crew. And once we get away from space station outside of the keep-out sphere and the approach ellipsoid, we'll actually transition to what's referred to as Dragon to Ground. So we'll be issuing a lot of that communication via Dragon's transmitters through those TDRS satellites back to ground.
So as we mentioned earlier, 63 days aboard the International Space Station for these two spacefarers. Was not their first flight. They both had two previous shuttle missions, and they both have families that are very excited to see them once they get home. I know some folks here around at SpaceX refer to them as the space dads. Both have young boys, and I know that they have to be excited to get back to their families soon.
And the space dads actually brought a cool zero-G indicator up with them. An Apatosaurus, a kind of sparkly Apatosaurus, who was sitting in the seat next to them for the ride up. And as I understand, their sons actually voted that that was going to be the zero-G indicator between the two of them.
They're also bringing something really interesting and with a lot of history to it back to the ground. There was an American flag aboard the International Space Station that flew on the first space shuttle mission and the final space shuttle mission, and it was left aboard the space station. That way it could be retrieved by the next crew who launched from America, and so they are also bringing home that piece of history as well.
Yeah, so I was looking up some facts earlier. The first space shuttle mission in April 1981. So that flag has been to space quite a while, and it's been on station now for about 9 years, which is a pretty long time to be in space.
Yeah, it's probably traveled more miles than any human ever, or any astronaut ever, for sure.
So if you're just joining us, we're currently looking at two views inside the Dragon spacecraft. The right now in the seats are spacecraft commander Doug Hurley on the left-hand side, or in the left-hand seat, and Bob Behnke, the Joint Operations Commander, in the right-hand seat. The crew got on board. They've had a relatively busy day packing cargo on board the spacecraft. They closed the forward hatch and the APAS hatch on the pressurized mating adapter on the International Space Station side. And they're currently in the middle of a vestibule leak check. So the vestibule, the space in between the two spacecraft being the International Space Station and Dragon. So we've brought that down to about 5 psi at this point, and verifying that there's no leakage from either side.
The International Space Station is also in the current proper configuration for that departure. They do something called feathering the solar arrays, and so what they do is they turn and lock them at an angle. That way, when Dragon leaves the space station, obviously it's going to use its thrusters, and those thrusters have exhaust that are emitted, and we don't want those to contaminate any of the solar cells on the arrays because that makes them less functional. They can't perform as well if they're coated in exhaust, and so those exhaust plumes avoid the solar arrays because they are feathered, and we also just don't want to put extra stress on the solar arrays. So it sounds like the International Space Station and is set up well for the upcoming departure of Crew Dragon.
And as kind of a preview of what's happening on the ground side, so operators and mission control in Houston, and of course operators here in mission control on Hawthorne, looking at the health of the vehicle systems. Right now we are in what are called joint operations because of our proximity to the International Space Station. And so in joint operations, the flight director out of Houston is actually the prime authority for any commanding or anything that'll occur up in space close to the International Space Station. So both teams are conducting health checks against a set of what we refer to as flight rules to check on the health of the vehicle, configuration of the vehicle, and then verifying that their procedures are go for undocking. All those checks happening concurrently with this leak check.
Yeah, and we'll be in those joint operations through the exit of the approach ellipsoid. So there are two invisible lines, sort of, that vehicles cross upon arrival and departure from the International Space Station, and these help us govern, we have specific rules for each one that the vehicle shouldn't cross if they violate any of those. And so some of those, for the keep-out sphere, that smaller sphere around the space station, we call that 4 orbits safe. So if the Dragon were for some reason lose control of any of its thrusters, it would be safe for 4 orbits if not hitting the International Space Station if it's inside that keep out sphere. And then the approach ellipsoid has a little bit of a